Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Debt Assignment Protocol workshop. My name is Amy. I work on the communications team for the Rec Code Manager, and I will be facilitating today's event. I have joining me today colleagues from across the Rec Code Manager team. So we have just a few bits of housekeeping to go through this morning. This session is being recorded, and the recording and slides for this event will be made available on the Rec portal next week. If everyone could please keep their microphones and cameras off unless speaking, it would be greatly appreciated. We will be using Slido today to facilitate your questions. So to ask a question, you can access Slido via the QR code that's currently on screen. If you're using the desktop app for Teams, you'll be able to see an S at the top of this call where you can click and access Slido. Or if you have a smartphone, you can scan the QR code and access Slido that way. Or alternatively, you can just type the number on screen into Slido on your web browser. Alternatively, if you want to raise a question verbally, please raise your hand on Teams. We will have designated discussion points throughout the session, but please feel free to raise your questions throughout as well. So I will now pass over to Rebecca to take us through the agenda for today. Thanks, Rebecca.
Lovely, thank you, Amy. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the next DAP workshop. I'm Rebecca Mottram and I'm part of the Performance Assurance team, and we're also joined today by a number of my other colleagues from the Performance Assurance team as well as Courtney from our Change team. So before we kick off, it's probably worthwhile if I give a brief overview and a bit of background to why we're meeting again today. So hopefully a number of you on the call were present at our first DAP workshop back in March. So we met originally to talk about potential options to improve the end-to-end DAP process. Off the back of those conversations and the outputs from those that initial workshop, we then ran a consultation in July. And the purpose of that consultation was really to start fleshing out and discussing and getting your feedback on some potential solution options to make improvements to the DAP process. And that consultation as well was a joint consultation with Rec Change Proposal R37, which Courtney will provide a quick update shortly in terms of where we're at with that and also key activities planned over the next coming weeks. So in terms of really the purpose of today's workshop, what we're looking to do is really to continue to take forward the discussions we've already been having and really start to flesh out some potential solution ideas to help improve the current DAP process. So as Amy's already mentioned, we really want this session to be as interactive as possible. So please do use Slido to drop any questions you have. But also there's going to be plenty of opportunities where you can raise your hand and also we'll come to you for you to share your inputs and opinions on different solution ideas as we run through that session as well. So in terms of the agenda for today, so as I mentioned, Courtney's going to start off with an overview in terms of progress on Rec Change Proposal R37 and the activities planned over the next coming weeks. We're then going to move on to the next session, which is going to focus on exploring potential solution ideas to improve DAP. So we'll be inviting your views on some of the proposals we've worked together based on consultation feedback and also previous discussions we've had. But it'd also be great to get your feedback on any benefits if we were to take forward some changes as well. So we did share a handout as part of the meeting invite this week, which sets out a bit of context, which I'm running through now, but also some of the questions we're going to run through today. So I appreciate not everyone might have had time to digest this information. So before I hand over to Courtney for an update on R37, what I'll do now is just quickly run through the 3 key areas or the solution ideas we want to cover as part of today's discussion. So Amy, if we could just move on a couple of slides, please. Perfect, thank you. So in terms of the discussions we want to have today, we want to run through some 3 key areas for potential improvements in the DAP process. So the aim here really is to look at what improvements we can make to improve overall completion rates, but also to try and reduce the number of exceptions and failure rates. So the first area we want to cover is looking at whether any additional fields or new rejection codes should be added to the current DAP data flows. So the aim here being really to help reduce the total number of rejections in the end-to-end process. So when we get to this discussion, it'd be great to get your views on this and some of our proposals, but also what are the benefits? So if we were to make these changes, what would be the benefits to consumers, but also, you know, industry if we were to make those changes? The second area we want to cover looks at potential options for merging any of the data flows that contain some identical information and whether there'll be any efficiencies made if we were to do that. And then the third area we want to look at is just an open discussion on other opportunities to make the DAP process more efficient. So for this item, we really want you to come with an open mind and make any suggestions, share your ideas in order for this to be a really great discussion. So in terms of the approach for that session, what we'll be doing is running through the current what the current DAP process is. We'll be looking at some original proposals we shared as part of the consultation, what the consultation feedback was, and some new or amended proposals based on that feedback. We'll be looking at potential rationale for making those changes and then opening up to discussions to get your feedback. I hope that makes sense and has got all your brains starting to work and start clicking for potential ideas to share. But before we kick off that session, I'll now pass over to Courtney, who's going to give an update on R37.
Next slide, please. Good morning, everyone. So as you can see on the screen, we're within the solution development phase for change proposal R37, which is seeking to introduce an effective and robust credit and debt balance transfer process for smart meters operating in prepayment mode with aligned improvements to the legacy processes. We're currently focusing on the smart meter elements of the change proposal and have planned a couple of workshops with a selected group of representatives in September to do a deeper dive into these specific areas. If you've not received an invite and your organisation has a keen interest in that particular part of the change proposal, please contact your OAM or the service desk and we can arrange an invite and attendance for you. Okay, thank you.
Very much. Hi all, my name is Vaishnavi Sharma and I will be taking you through first I'll start with giving an overview of the current DAP process before we dive into the various options we are proposing. Amy, if we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as you know, the current DAP process, so we've mentioned the electricity side flows here, but the same flows, similar flows with the G prefix are used in the gas side of things. So the DAP process starts when the losing supplier sends an objection through, and on receipt of that objection flow, the gaining supplier sends out a D306 or a G806 through requesting the debt information on the account, where the objection states that there is debt on the account. On receipt of this flow, the losing supplier then shares the debt information in the 307 flow or the 807 flow, which when the gaining supplier receives, they then make a decision whether they want to go ahead, and then they send the 308 or the 808 flow to accept that debt to be transferred. And once that's done, then the 309 is the confirmation of moving the debt amount and the details of it. Currently, when a losing supplier receives the 306 flow, they have access. They have the ability to respond with a rejection code, which are stated at the bottom of the screen. And the feedback we received was that often there is not enough options for suppliers to convey why exactly they're rejecting, and in such cases they may use the free text field to add more detail. So we want to standardize that, and therefore we're proposing some additional rejection codes. So this is the overview of the current process. Amy, if you move to the next slide, we can see what the information contained in some of these flows we've looked at are. The information that it's in green is the mandatory information that suppliers need to fill in, and the other fields they can populate, but they are not mandatory at the minute. So that is the current process for DAP. If we can move to the next section, please. Next slide, please. So our first proposal is around adding some additional mandatory information to the DAP flows. So as you can see, currently the customer phone name and the meter point address fields are not mandatory for suppliers to populate. However, we had proposed that these fields be made mandatory. If we can move to the next slide, please. And the rationale behind this was that we'd noted that a lot of the reasons why the DAP process was failing was because there wasn't enough data to validate, and there were name inconsistencies in several cases. There's also, we feel that having the address information will allow suppliers to resolve these inconsistencies faster. And we also think that if there were more rejection codes that suppliers could use, rather than using the text fields, it'll enable them to automate reports and work out the resolution quicker. So that said, if we can move to the next slide, please. So from the responses that we received to this consultation in July, some parties felt that there was already enough information in the existing data flows, whilst other parties felt, like one of the parties suggested that adding the DCC flag to this flow may also be useful. Some parties did flag that adding more validation fields may only increase the volume of rejection. So looking at this feedback, we have revised our proposal. And if we can move to the next slide, please, Amy. So we're basically saying that we're adding these additional rejection codes, which would enable suppliers to flag what the case of mismatch is, rather than just something like invalid information or invalid data. And the rejection codes that we're suggesting to add is wherein if it's a smart meter, the supplier initiates that flags that it is a smart meter on site, for which I think the R37 process is exploring alternative process for smart meters. So once that is in place, this field would be useful. Then for name mismatches, this can be easily flagged, and this can allow suppliers to come up with resolution sooner. For address mismatches, and also where customers do not wish to proceed further and the DAP process can then be terminated. So these are some of the suggestions we've got. And Courtney, if we move to the next slide, now is the opportunity to respond to the questions. So the questions we're asking is, do you agree with the approach where we're adding additional mandatory fields and rejection codes? And we're also asking if there's any other information you feel would be beneficial to include in these data flows. Please feel free to use the Slido option, or please raise your hand and feel free to speak on the call. Amy, do we have any responses on Slido yet?
We've not had anything come through on Slido yet. Just a reminder to anyone who needs to join, you can scan the QR code with your smartphone, and that will take you directly to Slido. Or you can type in the number on screen into your browser or your smartphone, and this will also take you to where you can submit your questions.
Anyone will have anything they want to raise their hands and suggest to the group? It might be useful if you've already logged into Slido, if we go back to the previous slide and look at those potential options. So any comments on adding new rejection codes or making some of those existing fields mandatory, or even changing any of the data as part of those data flows? It'd be really helpful to get people's feedback.
Yes, just to add, both in terms of if you are in favor of these changes, the benefits you think, if you can share those, or if you're opposed to these changes, what are some, blockers that you anticipate? Both would be of use for us to develop this further.
Carl Dennis has just raised a question on Slido. He said, I'm not sure that I understand the benefit of making the address field mandatory. Both parties should already know the address based on the MPXN.
So one of the reasons we felt that the address field may be mandatory, having it mandatory and having it available would be useful, wherein a customer may have they may know the incorrect MPXN number and may have shared the incorrect number, and which may have led to a customer name mismatch. So that is one case where we felt it may help. And some of the suppliers also did flag that often the DAP process does have address field inconsistencies, which leads to failure of the process.
Any other comments or questions? It's just it's probably useful just to give a little bit of context why we're asking for your feedback on this call as well. So when we ran the consultation back in July, we only got a handful of responses back from suppliers. So we thought it'd be useful just to open up to have some wider conversations on this as well.
Had another question come in. Would it be better to include the rel rather than the address/postcode?
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Does anyone have any comments or anything they want to add in terms of that question that we've just got in? Does anyone have any other views?
Just had another comment come in. So it says, I may be coming late to the party, so apologies. Is this review mainly focused on the process rather than broader issues around debt assignment protocol?
Well, people don't necessarily, need to come and speak about it. I guess broader issues and the process seem kind of to be the same thing to me. If there is things that you're aware of that are causing delays, additional work that's unnecessary, inefficiencies, I don't know, maybe the limits related to the process are inappropriate. I think we want to make this process work, and I think it's really important that it is quick and efficient, partly so suppliers don't need to have lots and lots of people sitting there kind of managing this process, doing lots of manual stuff, but partly because it's really important that consumers get resolution in this area, we do know that this is something that's a really important piece of market design, particularly at the moment. So have I answered your question? I think I haven't answered your question, but if you wanted to either pop into the chat, the Slido chat, which other areas we might be looking at, or jump on, you know, this can be a discussion. I guess we are here because we want this to work for you, if that makes sense.
Hi, Anton. I thought it's probably easier just for me to jump on the call and speak. It's Sakitra from Redco. So apologies, I am joining this late because John is away and I'm covering for him. So I might not know all the ins and outs of this, but it feels like this is very process focused, and so I was just trying to understand, and I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head. Actually, we need to understand better what the issues are so that we're making sure we're addressing the right things. And I don't know to what extent those broader issues have been raised. And if you've only had 6 responses, so perhaps suspect they might not be fully raised as to what those issues are, because we can fix the process, we can add more fields and we can add more rejection codes, but is that essentially addressing the issues that are causing the problems in the first place? You know, what is causing this in the first place, I think, is what I'm trying to understand. So and therefore, are we targeting our approach to fix it in the right place?
So Suchitra, this is the second of a series of, I think, only 2 workshops. In the first, we essentially asked that open question.
Okay.
Our diagnosis, you know, our symptom of the problem is this takes too long.
Right.
This takes too long. And the proposal from the code manager is that it probably takes too long because there is too much complexity and data interchange. And I think we want to have less data interchange, you know, more first time success. This should mean the process completes quicker, which is important for someone who wants to switch, and, you know, has less effort on the supplier, which is important in this climate. And it's important in general. We don't want to bake inefficiency in for no reason. So we have talked about a lot of things. When we're talking about putting in mandatory fields, we're saying, like, let's make sure you have, as a supplier, you have the data so you can resolve the process quicker without having lots and lots of questions between you, lots of bilateral exchange, which essentially increases the cost to serve of the supplier and harms the consumer outcome. So I am up for anyone on the call challenging me if I have not articulated something that is the real problem, or if there are other parts, you know, whether it's the process, whether it's the £500 limit, whether it's the, you know, somewhat loose definition of complex debt, you know, any of these areas, if you think they are a problem to be sorted, now is an opportunity to do so. We've proposed, to the best of our knowledge, what we think are some possible solutions, and I guess we want to test acceptability and to be kind of either challenged or built upon by those on the call.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I raised a question because I did wonder about the limit, the £500 limit, and whether in today's, where we are today with the cost of energy, whether that is, you know, isn't that a problem? Is that causing a problem? Is that likely to cause a problem while we're looking at that? While we're looking at this, is this something we should have in our mind's eye, that actually that limit might be something we need to revisit? So yeah, so those are my thoughts, and I've probably hijacked the call enough, so I shall leave you to proceed.
Well, thanks for your input. I guess we should pose that question. We've mentioned specifically the £500 limit. I don't think our current proposal involves a change to that limit. I think our assumption is, and it is an assumption, we don't have a grounded evidence base to say whether this is correct or not. That's why we're getting your views. Our assumption is, if the data interchange process is better, this could complete quicker. So I think a question to the market participants on the call, are we comfortable with the current £500 limit? Clearly there needs to be some limit, or is this something that should, you know, kind of be extended? I feel like it would be reducing it might be reducing it doesn't seem like the right thing to me, but should it be extended? Should that be part of one of our proposals here?
I don't have an answer, so I'm going to switch my mic off and my camera off, but somebody else might have a view on that.
Yeah, whilst everyone's pondering on that question, I've seen that Carl sent in another question on Slido. He's asking whether the minutes and recordings from the March workshop are available. I was wondering if Millie or Amy could share a link, but yes, there's a recording on the portal, there's the slides on the portal as well. We also did a handout which we shared as part of the bulletin following the session on key discussions and outputs and how we were going to take it forward. Also, there's obviously the consultation document on the portal as well, which sets out some background on the discussions and the questions we wanted to ask and take forward as part of those discussions. So the March workshop was like a really helpful session. There was a good attendance of, I think, about 20 odd suppliers. So we had quite a lot of group discussions and lots of ideas came forward. So yeah, the purpose of this session is really just to continue those discussions that we kicked off back in March.
Thanks, Rebecca. So we do actually have the recording on our YouTube channel, and I think Millie is posting the link to that in the meeting chat. It's not currently on the portal, but I think we're looking to get that on the portal. Sorry, to clarify, that's the recording from the Debt Assignment Protocol workshop on the 31st of March.
Brilliant. We have a hand up. Ed?
Yeah, hi there. Just some thoughts around it, really. I'm not particularly close to the DAP process, but sort of taking a step back and looking at it holistically. I think, first off, the £500 limit, historically, that's always seemed fine, but we are treading into sort of uncharted waters in terms of the level of average customer debt sort of across the entire industry. I know that as an organisation, we do have a lot of customers that do have debt. Our proportion is relatively high compared to others. It seems that at the moment, the limit in itself seems fine, but I think there should be a process put in place for reviewing that, particularly following, you know, the change of government that's coming in, what plans they're going to put in place in terms of stabilising energy prices, which would very much have an impact on whether or not that level of £500 is appropriate. So would it be possible to, as part of this, have some sort of review process baked into DAP holistically that would allow that £500 limit to be reviewed?
I think that's a really smart thing. I am thinking on the fly, but there's a couple of ways we could do this. So we could do RFIs routinely. So I don't know, just thinking on the fly, on the 1st of September every year, we'll ask for a profile of your prepayment debt so that we can understand if that limit is still appropriate. We could include it as park data. So like, this is not something that we want every month, certainly that. Well, actually, it would tell us some things every month, but there is a kind of a cost benefit trade-off here. We know if we ask for things every month, you know, that is a cost, but we could ask for profiling data on the level of debt on your prepayment meters so we can understand the health of the market. Now, I think this goes to an area of sensitivity and an area that I need to be really clear about. If we are asking you about your debt on your meters in a kind of a performance assurance role, we are not necessarily thinking about your performance. We're thinking about the performance of the code and the market, and it might, you know, it might mean, oh look, it's, as Ed is suggesting, if we collect this information routinely, it tells us, oh, the market's a bit more healthy, or the DAP process is kind of fitting the reality of what's going on in people's lives. it wouldn't be to be, oh, supplier Z's profile has changed, let's hold them to account. That's not what it would be. So I think we will take an action here to think about the best way of getting similar data to this that Ed suggests, to look at market health and appropriateness of these limits, and we will consider like the cost benefits on frequency, if that makes sense. I don't think we need it every month, certainly it seems, but we don't want it every 10 years, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. If the government wasn't talking about the changing the cycle of price cap review, I would have said link it to price cap.
Yeah.
But yeah, the world we're in at the moment, who knows what's going to happen? But as long as we're open or perceptive to the idea that the limit should be reviewed at some point. My other question really, and this may have been covered in previous engagement sessions, is there a link between the end goals of FMRS and what we're trying to do here with DAP?
I think that's probably something we have to take away to make sure alignment. What's the best way to say this? One of the challenges of this job is constantly moving different areas, but it's super important that we're the ones that manage that risk. I think it's really helpful that you've pointed it out. But yeah, I think we'll take that away and make sure there is alignment before, what's the word to say this, before we progress too quickly. That's
yeah, I wouldn't want to be sort of double dipping in the topic, if you like. A change here to address, ticket 37, and then also having to review the process when we know what we're going to definitively have to do to accommodate FMRS. It seems to be that a lot of the proposals put forward for this ticket are aimed at sort of speeding up this process, or in particular getting the right information about those levels of debt between suppliers at the earliest stage possible, so that suppliers at both ends have got a proper view about where and when it's right to place a debt-based objection on a change of supply.
Yeah, and actually I think
it kind of feels like it goes hand in hand with what FMRS is trying to do in the overall reduction of switching times and just making the process so much cleaner and more efficient.
Ed, you're entirely right. Sorry, there was a bit of, I probably wouldn't have called it FMRS. We talk about faster switching, but so one of the questions that Vaishnavi has later in this slide is, should there be a linkage between CSS messaging, maybe CSS objections, and this process? Fundamentally, we have in the industry multiple data flows. CSS is kind of a data flow system, isn't it? I know it's not exactly, but trying to make sure the right things happen in the right channels and are appropriately linked is a really important thing for us. So we did want to explore that.
We've had a couple of comments come in from Carl Dennis through Slido. So he said the limit probably needs to be looked at. However, right now all guidance is for customers to stay put. Another idea could be DAP to allow debt to be purchased where the debt has been accrued on a credit account and the customer wants to move to a PP supplier.
Okay, that is an interesting and new idea. So this is about looking at this beyond just the prepayment process, but integrating the prepayment and the credit meter process. I think that is a good idea, but for me, we know that the DAP process as it currently stands we have real evidence that it doesn't provide consumer outcomes. I think we should fix that, and what you've talked about should also go into we've got a log of consumer issues, and then we should validate, where that sits in the relative priorities. But yeah, no, I think I think that's a really good idea. In fact, I think we should probably pick it up with you later, not in a massive detail, but just to make sure that we've accurately captured, you know, the thing that we need to pick up and put onto our consumer issues log. Okay. Just on the point, just on the point about switching is it's not such a thing at the moment. We do have to acknowledge that this has been a problem for a while and that the change process is not instant. So with switching at a lower volume, it's important that we try and fix this so that, you know, when there is more switching later on, that this works better. I think this is perhaps an opportunity for us to mend the roof a little bit, you know, but whilst it's not raining. I'm sorry, Rebecca.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as well as the options we're talking about today, obviously Courtney did highlight that there's going to be some other workshops planned over the next few weeks in terms of progressing R37 and the solution development activities there. She did mention that one of the initial workshops is going to look at smart prepayment elements. So yeah, a part of Carl's suggestion, I think we can take that forward as part of those discussions as well. Obviously we can link back to you, Carl, and get some further information, but yeah, the aim of today's session is just to really collect as much feedback as we can, and we'll be joining the dots between, you know, all the feedback we're getting through these different workshops in order to take forward some, you know, a change proposal and you know, the solution as part of R37. So any ideas anyone has, you know, we can obviously have those discussions today, but, you know, we're going to be having some further workshops as well.
Thanks, Rebecca. If there's no other questions, let's move on to the next section. Amy, if you can please move one more slide and another one, please. Thank you. So our next solution is on looking at the data flows. We noted that the 306 and the 308 flow, they contain identical information, apart from obviously the 308 also contains the earlier submission date. So our proposal was, will it be beneficial for suppliers if the two flows were merged and suppliers send a 306 flow at 2 points, one before like requesting the 307 and another one where once they've received the 307. And the other bit would be if they do not accept the switch, they could then at that point, rather than sending the second 306, they could annul the switch. So that was our proposal. Amy, if we can move to the next slide, please. So the reason for proposing this change is that merging it's identical information, so we're trying to simplify the process where we can, and also when we're also reducing the timescales for a supplier to respond to. So currently, I think the losing supplier has 4 working days to respond, and over here we are, the gaining supplier has 4 working days to respond, and we're basically saying reduce that time to 3 working days from when you've received the debt information from the losing supplier, and basically take a decision whether you want to proceed with the debt transfer or not. With that in mind, Amy, if you can move to the next point, please. Some of the feedback that we've received is that some parties were divided here. Some parties felt that 3 working days would be enough time, but they also felt that it still wouldn't make DAP fast enough for faster switching. Other parties felt that 3 working days would not be enough time to carry out all the activities that need to be done in order to take that debt on. And also some parties did highlight that merging of the flows may impact their internal processes. So this was the feedback that we received. If we can move to the next slide, please, Amy. So our questions to you, in which case, are there any other ways that you think, or even the ways that we've proposed, that you think the DAP process could be made more faster and more efficient? And also, I know we touched upon some of this earlier, but how can we simplify the DAP process so that, you know, we can be more aligned to faster switching? And also if there's any other steps and flows or that you feel that can either be merged, removed, or brought forward, please feel free to suggest those. Again, the Slido link's on the page, and if you wish to raise your hand and speak, that would be great. Ed.
Hi, me again.
Yep.
Just a bit of food for thought / a bit of an observation around the slides we've just seen there. Changing fields in a flow, changing flow numbers, and timings of changing flows are all quite significant activities. So I'm not saying it's not the right thing to do to merge the flows together. I'm just saying when you've got the bonnet open about timings of flows, populations of fields, the order that flows are sent in the process, have you taken a step back and had a look at actually what would a blue sky world version of the DAP process look like? Taking away the existing processes, starting afresh, what would that look like as opposed to making significant changes to an existing process?
I love the claps. I love the claps. So we, yeah, to some extent we did this, right? So there definitely needs to be data interchange between suppliers. There's no way we can have a zero message process. Information needs to change hands. In our first workshop, we explored at a high level the concept of, I think it was a 1 message, 2 message, 3 message solution. So in a way that was us attempting to do this. However, you know, there has to be some kind of limitations on the level of change, because the smaller changes are easier to implement, aren't they? And whilst I do love radical changes, they can either get bogged down and not happen, or take a long time to take place. So I think the assumptions that we've worked on are that this would still follow the DTN. I think a more radical solution, a totally blue sky solution, may involve not putting this on the DTN, but using other data interchange approaches, maybe CSS. But I think the reality of where we are at the moment is that may effectively mean that it gets put so far down the line that this change doesn't take place. I think the other thing that we've assumed is that certainly if some of the stuff that's there is working, then we should use it. Now, clearly a future process is going to involve sharing the customer name, is going to involve what we think sharing the customer address and the MPAN. So yeah, so I think they're the assumptions that we proceeded on. Now, you'll hear me say this on these challenges, on these calls. If we have been insufficiently radical and those assumptions are wrong, please tell us what we should do differently. I want this process to work. I think there are definitely places where the code does need the approach that Ed has described, where we need to think about, you know, what should it be, not how should we incrementally change it. So kind of putting that back on you, Ed, or everybody else, frankly. If our assumptions are wrong and we were going to do this from a kind of a blank sheet of paper, a blue sky approach, I hope my assumption that data interchange is required is correct. I'd be quite worried if I'm wrong on that. But where would the right place for this to be? You know, should this be over the DTN? Should this be some other way? Should there be a way that this happens instead of by agreement, but kind of in an objection architecture? I'd please challenge us. I am up for it.
I'd say potentially the inclusion of the debt data as default data when the customer is changing.
In the switch request.
Yeah, I believe DTN is fine to
yeah.
pass this data through. You know, the process does essentially work. I think that two thoughts spring to mind. Number one is, if the change in itself is too big a change, too radical a change, is it better to stick with the existing process and really tighten up the performance assurance elements of it to ensure the suppliers are being held to account? Just food for thought. I'm not necessarily recommending it. Or alternatively, removing removing the stages in the process that require objection.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and just have it as part and parcel of the changeover details, provided the debt is under £500. Yep, here you go. Here's your customer information. There's their debt information. It's not an objection. It's just part of the data that's passed across and is processed as BAU. And it only becomes an exception where the debt is complex, over £500, or other reasons that an objection process is involved.
Yeah. So I think we were talking about this as a one message solution with an objection. So I like where you're thinking in terms of performance assurance. The reason this discussion exists is that we measure the performance across the industry in lots of different areas, and DAP timelines is one of the things we look at. We look at the end-to-end timeline, which is what the customer cares about. In almost every case that we have observed, the timeline is not met, and in many of the cases, I think we covered this in the last workshop, but it might be of the order of 2/3, DAP messages are sent and the process doesn't get through to like a finished state, which is either acceptance or rejection. There's kind of a piece where they just kind of disappear. Because that happens across the piece, our view is when we see something happening to everybody that is not an acceptable level of performance, that probably isn't due to the individual participants. It's probably not, pick your favorite supplier, and it's probably not their fault, right? Because it's also the next person's on the list who's also performing poorly. So when we assess that performance data, we think that there is a structural problem that requires the codes, the process and the kind of supporting elements of the process, such as the limits and the information that's exchanged, to change. So that is our diagnosis. That's how come we started on workshop 1. So I do not think a kind of performance assurance, kind of RFI self-assessment, our team going out and doing assessments of suppliers is appropriate at all in this case. There are times when that's appropriate. I think the process must change for there to be a possibility that success will kind of go forward. Andy, you had your hand up.
Morning. So I didn't want to interrupt you, but I think some of the conversations that we're having are quite useful here, and I think what it's kind of leading me to is kind of questioning some of the assumptions that we're coming into this for. So I mean, I actually agree with Ed that tinkering with the data flows and tinkering with the timescales is kind of, it might improve the process marginally, but there is a cost to that, because all of this is, or a lot of this is automated, or it's not automated and it's manual, and this costs more money to suppliers to deliver. And I think where I kind of head towards is are we making the right assumptions for what needs to be there? What are the absolute non-negotiables of what DAP has to have in order to transfer debt between one supplier and another? Because ultimately, the customer who leaves yesterday and joins a new supplier tomorrow is almost certainly going to be the same customer. It's highly unlikely that that's going to be a different customer, but do you have to check that? How rigorous does that process need to be? There's also the old adage of follow the money, isn't it? So where are the incentives here? Are the incentives on suppliers to facilitate this? Are the incentives on the customers to do such and such? I think some of the assumptions at the start of the DAP process are going to be really key to kind of working out where we can make it faster, etc. And that's some of that is sort of deep rooted in R37 and that mod, but that's kind of where I'm thinking at the moment.
So I think that's really helpful, and I think we're most motivated to try and fix it. And if we're putting forward proposals, we're trying to put forward proposals to fix it. What should we do differently in the light of this conversation?
I think for me, one of the challenges has always been this customer name matching.
Yeah.
Where does that come from, other than it's a really good excuse to not do it? You know, if it turns out that there is a true legal requirement for that to exist, you know, and suppliers cannot do anything to do with debt transfer without that customer name matching and making sure you've got the same customer, then that is there's a starting point. So we would then have to find the quickest and most efficient way possible of actually doing that customer name matching. But I have to say, I've never been wholly convinced that that's absolutely essential to the process. So I mean, and that's just one of the examples, you know, and all the other reasons that this can fall over, I think, is stuff that I would be challenging and actually finding out whether is absolutely essential to the process, or whether it's a bolt-on that gives protections, real or not real.
Well, and it might be there are some bolt-ons that give protections that don't stop the process. So there might be that we have some mandatory parts of the process that sort the customer's element out. And there might be some other bits that help predominantly the gaining supplier have sufficient information. I assume they'd still be mandatory, so that they can keep going in whatever operational activities they need, so as to kind of facilitate the supplier. I think it's really important that customer journey happens very quickly. That other piece, if there is another piece of data interchange that's really needed, seems to me that can happen in kind of slow time, if that, you know, not months, but, you know, not immediately on the switch.
I agree. I think we've got to a point where I assume I've made an assumption in this whole session that we're talking both smart meters and legacy prepay meters, and we can't have a world where we've got smart meters and, you know, fancy technology and next day switching, but that takes 3 months. That just it's kind of an unacceptable place for the industry to be in, really.
I totally agree.
Sorry to interrupt. We've had a couple of questions come in through Slido from Erin Williamson. So the first is, would the 306 still be sent twice?
Yes. So on that note, the proposal basically states that wherein the supplier accepts the debt, they issue a 306 with the date of earliest transfer, so earliest they can register the customer. Where they refuse to take the debt on, they then annul the switch rather than, you know, and exit the DAP process altogether. Does that answer your question, Erin?
Yeah, it does. Sorry, excuse this. I am not well at the moment. But essentially, to me, I think the issue is if we're sending the 306 twice, it's, to me, we're essentially just changing a number on the flow, but it's going to make it more confusing for coming into the system. How do we know that is the second 306 and we're not then restarting the whole process from the start? Especially if we sort of have it automated, I think it might cause sort of more confusion in that. I think previously, so this will link on to sort of the second question that I asked. Previously, 308s for us were the part of the process that took the most amount of time, and that was waiting on resubmission of sales orders. Because if we stuck to the SLAs on them, they ended up coming in the next week, and it was pointless then cancelling it and then resubmitting it all back into the process because it was just more clunky for us. And the 09 part, where we were waiting on the supply essentially leaving to make sure that they didn't cancel it during the cool-off period, etc. Now with faster, more reliable switching, are we going to sort of calibrate the length of time that DAP takes with that industry improvement? Because to me, we got through the first two parts of the process on our side really quickly.
Yeah.
Those were the parts that took time, and that's where we've seen improvement since this was looked at.
So that's really interesting. We have, so the way the performance measurement works is we're matching, 3 or 6, 7, 8s and 9s. And like places you fall out, like complex DEP. So we're looking primarily at the end-to-end time, but we're also looking at the individual bits. We should look at the level of data granularity we have, because if it is the case that the stuff up front happens pretty quickly, and then there's delays as you've described, Erin, that could be the area that we focus on. Now, I do have some concerns as we work through this, that we know we have a problem and we need to make sure that we do make some progress. So I would suggest that we can look at the pre-existing data. I'm not off the top of my head clear if we track all that data at that transaction level, or if we kind of take the aggregate data, because it varies in different cases. But I think one of the things that this workshop is telling me is that there is more thinking required. There are other things to consider and refine our proposal. But I do think it's also quite important that we get a proposal and a change process stepping forward through the process, so that we don't get stuck in paralysis of analysis.
Yeah, I just think that part's gone from taking potentially up to 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And that's not waiting on the sales order coming in. Some accounts we have can sit for a month within those two flows, and we can get through the other part within days of, like, literally a number of days. So when we're removing something that can take a month and it goes to then taking 5 days with faster, more reliable switching, has a huge sort of benefit already happened.
Yeah, I think that's relevant, and we'll have data on this. I don't quite know the timelines that we get it. We get it obviously after the fact, but we can look at this after the first set of data is in. Yeah, I think that's helpful. I think that's really helpful. Were there any other bits on these areas?
We've had another question come through on Slido from Carl Dennis. He said, I think I suggested this previously, but I do think consideration should be given to allowing debt under £500 to switch anyway, and then agree DAP post-switch. Yeah,
so love it. Radical, thoughtful. We obviously need to consider the implications of it. I think there's something in it, the next section. Vaishnavi, do correct me if I'm punting it to the wrong place and that's unhelpful.
So the next section we will we can move on to that if you want. Amy, if you can move to the next slide, please.
And Carl, we will answer it, right?
Yeah.
We're not going to drop this, but I just thought we thought of similar thoughts.
Yeah. So next slide, please. So what we're suggesting here is that the 306, rather than waiting for an objection to be received from, so it's not quite in the lines of what Carl's suggesting. However, it's trying to bring the DAP process forward. So wherever a supplier gets a new customer or initiates a switch, they also request the debt information under the assumption that if there is any debt information losing supplier, please give me whatever the debt information may be on this account. And that's when, like, rather than waiting for a 306 to a D67 to be issued, a 306 is sent with the initial switch request. That then said, the 307 is shared by the losing supplier whilst they object. They say that there is debt on this account, and by the way, this is the information relating to that debt. This would then again allow suppliers to, it'll condense the timescales and allow suppliers to then take that information on. However, again, going one step forward, and as Carl's suggesting, would it be beneficial to just assume like all debt under £500 is non-complex, and suppliers should be expected to transfer that amount of debt as they gain a supply point? So that is our proposal. If we move to the next slide, please. A rationale behind this is to shorten timescales, and basically we understand there is information that gaining supplier and losing supplier need to gather and share through the DAP process. So we want to bring that information forward, and we understand that in order to share that information, the gaining and losing suppliers need a DAP privacy notice to be in place to have been issued to the customer, and the gaining suppliers do issue this at the point of acquisition, so they do not need to wait for the objection to be received to request any debt information if exists on the account, and also the losing suppliers would be able to then share as whilst they're objecting to this information. So yep, that next slide, please. So based on this proposal, the feedback that we received during the consultation was that the main concern parties had was, would this change be in line with the data protection and privacy regulations that apply? And some parties felt that as long as this could apply, like this could be within the remit of those regulations, they may be willing to consider this. So moving to the next slide, please. So our question, therefore, is to everyone, again, taking Carl's point as well, can suppliers, as you complete a switch where there is non-complex debt as is with the information available and proceed with the DAP processes later? And also the other two questions on the slide here. Should gaining suppliers request the debt information when they initiate the switch? Would this mean that sharing customer phoneme, which is not a part of the current switching request, before an objection is received, would that be okay with suppliers? And then when losing suppliers object to a switch due to debt on a customer account, would they be able to share, or should they be sharing the D307 data about that debt whilst raising an objection rather than waiting for any other communications to come from the gaining supplier?
I think Carl has his hand up.
Mm-hmm.
While you're on mute.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I've finally got the kids to be quiet as well as using Slido so much. Yeah, I just thought I'd kind of elaborate a little bit on my, I don't know, wild ideas maybe. Rather than needing to send the DAP flows initially, additional data fields in your kind of registration and objection flows might be better utilised. So when you send in your registration flow, you could just put an indicator in to say, yes, you're interested in the debt information. You know, make it a conditional field rather than mandatory. So if prepay and you want to purchase debt, tick the box to say you want the information, and then the objection flow could then, rather than give the precise debt information, could have another conditional field, and it would just sort of say A is 0 to 250, B is 251 to 499, and C is 500 plus, and then at that point you know whether you want to proceed or not based on your party's appetite for risk, I guess.
Carl, you said it was radical. It just seems very sensible. No, please check other people in the industry.
It's a bit sort of rip it up and start again, but
it's not, is it? It's the same thing. Give people the information they need, but try and cut the cost by not having loads of people need to send it in different ways. Giving it to them the first time. We want, as a general principle, we want everything to be efficient and you to get the information when you need it. That is the point of all the inquiry services. That is the point of the central switching service, that in this case suppliers have the information they need to do the thing that they need to do at the right time efficiently. That's the whole point. So yeah, I think it makes sense. I sit with a specific view of the world, don't I, from where I am. I'd welcome suppliers in particular if there's a good reason why Carl's idea, it makes a lot of sense to me, but if there's a thing that we haven't thought about here, now is a really good time to nip it in the bud?
I mean, it could have a more significant impact on parties who've got much larger market share in the prepay world.
Yeah.
You know, I'm kind of just looking at, I can only work on our customer base and how that might impact us, as well as trying to get a better outcome for the consumer overall.
Yeah, which is really important. Sorry, Andy, you have your hand up.
Yeah, it's just genuinely not here to plug my own mod, but this is basically what R37 is doing. It's pushing forward the switch, and then you sort out the money afterwards, is essentially what that's doing. It just takes it a step further and looks at credit balances as well as debt balances. But you know, I completely agree with you, Carl. I think I think it's such a sensible idea that I've raised a mod to do it. So
yeah, right. So that means that we need to make sure all activity is integrated, which is why we're talking about DAP, and we've got representatives of the people working on the solution development there. But I think perhaps from a performance assurance angle, which is kind of my day job, we need to provide the right information and evidence that gets the appropriate priority. And I think from what we see from market performance at the moment, I think it's pretty clear that this is something that needs to change. In terms of the other questions on the screen, were there kind of any other thoughts?
If not, should we, I think that brings us to the close of the 3 proposals that we've sent. Amy, if you want to. Yeah, I think the next slide, please. Yep. Anton, do you want to?
Yeah. So I think the first and most important point is thank you for taking the time out of your day to come here. I really do appreciate this is a crazy time in the energy market, and I think it's been an hour and a bit now. That is time that you could be doing other things. I really appreciate it. We really do want to make sure that our change and performance assurance approaches solve the problems. We want to get them first time as best as we can. I think this is an area where I think it's also important to show to you that performance assurance is not previously I worked in a regulator and I worked actually assured the enforcement division of a different regulator. We're not an enforcement division. We're here to do a range of different things, and one of them is find out where it's not working and try and fix what's working. I wanted to really thank those who contributed. You are changing our thinking, and I don't think right in this moment we know exactly how we'll take them forward, but we are going to think about them, particularly in that R37 change proposal. It seems particularly important to us that we pick the right combination of changes to processes so that we can have minimal change for you, but also we can kind of get it done. A couple of things I just wanted to reflect upon. Ed, your kind of push for us not to just tinker and to look at that kind of wider approach. We're definitely going to take that on board. I think talking about these conditional fields on a registration flow seems very sensible. I think, Andy, your challenge on what the key assumptions are, like this address matching, so that we can only, so suppliers only have to do work that they have to do, right? And then there isn't kind of like some spurious bonus work that we think is a good thing, like address and name. Sorry, it wasn't address, it's name matching, so that we can get this to work quicker. And Erin, I think one of the things that I learned from you was, we are looking end to end. That's what we are doing. But actually, Erin is experiencing fast bits and slow bits. and that maybe we need to look in a bit more detail so that we make sure if there are fast bits and slow bits and we change them, that we're sensible about the fast bits and the slow bits. I do think there is definitely a point as well that Carl made a couple of good points, but that Carl made about that £500 limit, and that we need to think about an appropriate way to get information on this, managing like the benefits of getting data fundamentally to me and our team versus kind of the costs which are borne by others, and we need to be conscious of getting the right balance there. Clearly it seems like there's something that's useful information, but getting the right balance and not being overly burdensome is important. So there's some of the things that I took away. I'm sure some of the other people on the call will have taken a few extra bits, and we'll have a wrap up call internally. What's important is, I think, that we feed back to you and to kind of industry governance organisations like the PAB what we learned and what we will be doing differently as a result. But I just wanted to go back to that big thank you. You're taking time out of your day to make things better. It's not gonna be better next week. You know, it's easy to skip these things. So thank you for spending time to make things better for the industry, and like really better for some very, very vulnerable people who, you know, it's easy to talk about this as a process, but for some people, losing 20 quid for a month might mean they don't buy their children shoes or something like that, or something else horrendous. So it is important that we do this. So yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Anton. Just to quickly jump in, so in terms of next steps, obviously R37 is being progressed. Courtney mentioned there is going to be some further workshops going on as well. So we will be using any outputs and all the discussions what Anton's just nicely concluded there to help shape you know, the work that needs to go on, the future workshops, some of the discussion points as well to be covered there. But before we close, does anyone have any further comments, general feedback, anything they want us to pick up as part of that further solution development? If there's not, we can close, and yeah, watch out for future invites for more discussions in this area.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, just to confirm, we haven't received any further questions on Slido, so I think we can wrap up for today. Thank you to everyone for participating. We would greatly appreciate your feedback on today's event, and we've actually set up a quick survey on Slido, so you'll be able to see that on your phones or on your desktop if you're already logged in. Please feel free to submit any feedback that you may have on today's event, and yeah, have a good day everyone. Thank you.